In the previous movie, we saw how to create a simple drag animation on hair. And it was basically doing this simple head turn. Now, in this movie, we'll look at the same process, but we're going to apply it to a slightly more detailed design and see how it differs. Now, the difference between a very simple hair setup or design and the kind that you often see, in Flash and Harmony projects, and maybe a more complex one or a more detailed one, would be, the difference between the figures on the left and the right. On the left, you see the basic hair blocks as, these big triangular shapes. On the right side, the design is a little more intricate, and we're beginning to break it up into smaller units. So we have, a larger area, maybe a smaller one, sometimes a third. So here is the animation we created in the previous movie, very simple shapes. And here is the same animation, but now we've upgraded or increased the level of detail in the bodies of hair to see, a much more complex design. So here's a reminder of what the original design was like with the hair divided into our three shapes. And now the more advanced design where we subdivide these forms so that the left side is now made of three, a large, medium and small regions in blue and red. The top is also in three and the right side's in two. And you can make as many as you like, but I thought this was more than enough to be showing for this movie. So this now gives us many more areas to play with and to have to control. So let's look at the animation keyframes. I'm going to overlay them now for direct comparison. So you'll notice some subtle touches. See how the tuft of hair on the front, being a bit smaller, reacts to the air resistance much more than the larger mass behind it. So I'm talking about this area right here, this very small triangular wedge. This area here is large, this area here is small. So it has less mass, so it's more easy to push around. So notice some subtle changes. See how the tuft of hair at the front, and I'm talking about this area here, this point to this point. It's smaller, so it's more prone to reacting to the air than the larger mass behind it. It's lighter, more like a feather. So you can see how that triangle is now pushed back just a little more than the rest. So notice the black area here, the frame before, this little tuft is sticking in front of this triangular mass behind it, and on the red frame, it's being pushed back further than it. And that's going to create a nice comparison between the two frames when they animate. So in general, you want some variety so that the relative positions of these smaller areas are slightly different from the larger areas. Otherwise, it's going to look like they're all glued together and it'll look really stiff. So frame 9 in blue, the front tuft is still dragging more than the mass behind it. And again, that's this area here. You see it's reversing a little bit too. And the trailing tuft is also this area, this one here, to the red, to here, is also reversing. So it's more vulnerable to the wind and being shoved around by it. And finally, we have the settle. Now, let's look at these 4 keyframes without the overlays. First the start, then frame 5. And again, notice these tufts are beginning to drag more. You'll see, a similar effect sometimes happening down here with these. And we have our reversals here. And if we compare again this trailing edge here, it reverses also. We have more drag on this little area. It's being pulled away from this larger wedge in the front, and then it settles. So here is the final animation again. Notice that all the blocks roughly travel together, but because of these small differences in the amount of drag, they also appear to have independent properties of air resistance. And because we're moving things at different speeds and arriving at different times, the final result is very naturalistic and effective. The most detailed form of hair that you'll see is the classic design that we see in the movies by Disney and Don Bluth and the other great traditional feature studios. You can see an example of this on the right side, and you compare it with the more stylized TV style on the left or the intermediate halfway look in the center. So you may be looking at that complex image on the right and wondering how on earth do you begin to animate something with so many points? How do you control it? And so we're going to take a closer look at that. So when you design or animate this style of hair, there are 5 important principles I want you to keep in mind. First, you keep the spacing of the hair irregular. You want small areas next to wide ones with narrow strands breaking off. Variation. You must avoid anything that looks regular or artificial, like the image to the right side. That's this one right here. That's a no-no. Second, use points of origin. So in this example, on the second row, we have strands of hair which originate from the point of origin marked by that little red cross. So you can have many points of origin. You don't have to have all the hair coming from one, but you can have a clump of hair on the left side with one point of origin, a point on the top of the head with one point of origin. But the important thing is you have to have the hair coming from 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 coherent points. Thirdly, as often as you can, not always possible, but most of the time, construct your hair forms around strong S and C curves, and this will give you simple and strong shapes that are easier to control and animate. Fourthly, when you animate, you have to reverse these shapes so that you snap from one C or transition from one C curve into its reverse or into an S curve. And this is a very pleasing animation transition. This is what keeps the hair looking loose and soft and lifelike. Finally, you have to keep these blocks of hair consistent but also fluid. So it's this weird tightrope you have to walk. If they're too consistent, it'll look stiff. If they're too fluid, it will look like a mess. So by this I mean that if the hair is in a resting position or moving slowly, the points marked here as A, B, and C, you see in this bottom row, as we animate them slowly back and forth, you're going to want to keep them fairly consistent and identifiable. But let's say there's a sudden movement or a gust of wind. These can move very quickly and combine into new points or split and separate. So in this case, a gust of wind has come in, and points B and C have now bumped into one another and joined together, and a completely new tuft has shaken loose. And that could be the case for a few frames, 4, 8, 10, 12, 30 frames, and then it might fall back into this pattern or a different one. But the important thing is that the eye can more or less track the general movement from these points throughout the scene. Now here's a good example of constructing a complex hair design from a single point of origin, which is this kind of Einstein character. And it's not often you can do this, but sometimes it's possible. So this is a case where it's definitely possible. Here's another example in which different hair designs can be built around 2 or 3 points of origin. So we have, again, the point here, which is originating a lot of different points. But I could also, if I chose, define a separate point. I could create like another point here, if I felt it was necessary. Maybe it would be more realistic to have a point here and a point there. So these are creative decisions that you make, and don't be afraid to change your mind if you think one point of origin is being overloaded. And as you can see on the right, I've decided to go with 2, one in red and one in blue. And it just makes more sense from this design point to try that. And there's nothing stopping me from using a 3rd or a 4th if I felt they were needed. Fewer is better, but sometimes you need more. So here's an example of how to treat the hair in groups. So I've marked them out here in color for a better illustration. So you imagine the hair, again, in these separate bodies. They don't have to be glued together. So for example, there's nothing stopping me from breaking off this sliver here and joining it into the brown area. But as you move and as you draw, it's just a good way to imagine the hair as one total form, which can be subdivided into smaller forms as needed. And here's a good example of how to build a complex shape like beards or hair or big eyebrows around a simple C curve or an S curve. The original design looks very intimidating until you begin to break it down into the spine of the line of action that the hair is following. Now let's see how one goes about animating a body of hair drawn in this style. In the top row, you can see the 6 keyframes. On the bottom row are the same keyframes, but with the different sections of the hair marked out with letters and colours. Now, you may not be able to see these colours because they're kind of subtle, but the letters are certainly easy enough to see. And again, our timing is numbered down here in keyframes. And again, 24 frames per second, not 30. If you're doing this on 30, then you might want to just pad out the numbers a little bit, maybe 2 or 3 between each of these. So here's a close-up of the original start frame with these 6 main blocks of hair marked out. Now here's the final animation that we're working toward. And as you can see, it looks very loose and natural. And the entire hair is fluid, seems to be one continuous form. So now I've shown you the colors. There's a color overlay. So you can see these 6 blocks, so you can see what's following where. Now it's easier to track any given tuft of hair throughout the cycle. So this should be enough to show you already that I'm not just drawing a bunch of lines and hoping that you don't notice that one isn't moving logically. I plotted all of them. And this is, it may seem extreme, but this is the original traditional classical method of hand drawing hair. And I drew these by hand. They were all sketched by hand. Now, to really show you the control, here are the letter labels at the point of each block. It's kind of funny. And of course, a constant reminder that I give to people is to plot their arcs. So I plotted the arcs of each one of these points. You will often find when you plot the arcs that it exposes mistakes, some error that you've made. And I found a couple when I plotted my arcs. My brain, my eyes had went cross-eyed from all these points, and I was plotting one point into the wrong shape. Sometimes you can get away with that, but I thought for the purpose of this, I wanted it to be perfect for you. So here we go. So, this is definitely an extreme level of control, and many times you can be more loose with hair and get away with things that are maybe moving erratically, but you need to know the fine-tuning in case you do get into trouble. So again, here's our start frame, and I've got all our colors and letters. Frame 7, and notice that although we're treating these blocks of hair as separate, they still kind of have fuzzy edges. So these blocks can break, as I've said before, into smaller blocks or merge, and you're going to see some of this happening now. Now notice how the area in black has split off or evolved from the D shape. And I haven't colored it green because I wanted this to really stand out and catch your eye. Now, part of it could be breaking off the purple. So we could have this tuft here breaking off the purple and this part here breaking off the green. And on the next frame, we have like a much larger black area here. The E shape is also beginning to develop a little bit of variety. So this could also begin to break up into a different form. Now on frame 19, I've drawn the D shape, this area here, in depth. It's very easy to forget that we're drawing an object that's meant to be in 3D space, and it's not flat. It's not a paper cutout. So this big block here is now moving out toward us, like it's going to hit us in the face. It doesn't quite look like it, but you can imagine it like that. We're not limited to moving around an X, Y axis. We also have access to Z depth, like the area coming out toward the viewer out here. And this can sometimes be used to help you imagine different design solutions to some of these very elaborate hair paths. Now frame 25, and now we have a reversal happening on the A and the C blocks. If you look at the A block here, and again throughout, not just here, but in other areas, the A block is reversing, that's nice. And the C block is like an S curve, and now it's turning into a C curve. So I haven't mentioned it very much in the course of this, but reversal is a very important principle to apply throughout, these kind of very natural looking hair movements. And frame 31. And I just settled this right back into the end pose. I didn't do an overshoot. I could have, but I just wanted to get us back to our start position without doing 50 in-betweens to hand drawing 50 slow in-betweens. But you get the idea. And notice also the black area merges fluidly back into the C and the D shape. So if you're drawing in-betweens between this frame and this frame, there's nothing stopping you from in-betweening this shape back into the C shape and this shape back into the D. It depends on the design as you begin drawing and what feels best to you and what's going to make the most natural looking path. So I'm going to take one last look at the final animation. And when we bring all of these principles together, this is the result. There's a class of animation frame or drawing that you don't see it consciously, really, but you feel it. And these are usually the images that appear for 1 or 2 frames. And let's see a really classic example using the bouncing ball. So what's happening here as the ball gets dropped, it's slamming into the ground. You may be able to see the frame I'm talking about here. Let me just stop this and we'll just shuttle through frame by frame. And that's it, right there, the squash. Now you could ease out of that a little bit by having an in-between frame going from the squash into this shape here. But I wanted to show you this series so that you can see exactly what I mean. So if you want to play with this yourself, this is the series of frames that I used to create this action. And as you can see, frame 15 is the squash, 14 is a really extended breakdown, or you could even have that as a keyframe itself. And then we're back off the ground on 16, and we repeat this with ever smaller and smaller cycles. So again, just to go through, there's our frame that you feel but you don't see. And in the next movie, what we're going to do is see how this applies to something a lot more interesting than a simple ball. In the previous movie, I showed you how to do a bouncing ball using a frame or an image that you only see for one frame or maybe two or three. In that case, it was the impact of the ball on the ground. All well and good. How do you apply that to a simple or even a complex character animation? So let's take a look at this. I'll let it play through a couple of times so maybe you can guess what's happening here. So you notice on the big chomp, you're really feeling a lot of energy behind that. And where does that come from? Let's pause this on the anticipation, and I'll run through frame by frame. Bang, right there, and even bigger here. And notice how few frames that was. Now if I scrub back, let's go forward again, and just play. So you really feel it. It's a lot of power and force, but it's not done for so long that you have the time to really register the fact that we've done something ridiculous. If we used any more frames than 2 or 3, the danger would be this thing would begin to look mushy and very strange. It might be an effect you like, but it's not an effect that I want. I just wanted this to be like a shock value or just a sensation that something very, very intense has happened. So here is the sequence of frames. And from frame 1 we start, and 11 through 17 is a big looping anticipation. The anticipation for a very violent action should be a strong anticipation. If I had simply gone into the chomp, I don't think it would have worked very well. So if you're going to do a violent action, like a punch, then you really want to pull the arm back far prior to that fast punch action. Otherwise the punch, 1, it won't have energy, but 2, your eye doesn't have time to realize what's happening. So in this case, the anticipation is the big leftward motion on the head, down, then back and up. And then we ease out of number 17. And these little tick marks are general. This will be number 25, 24, 23, 22. There should be more little ticks in there, but you can't really fit any more in than that. 26 is easing into the huge, extreme frame of teeth, the wall of enamel. And then on 28, we're easing out of it. And then we're back to normality on 29. Notice the nose pops off here. There's no nose here. There's no nose there. You don't feel it because for only 2 or 3 frames, this is a visceral effect. And it's a great trick to use. And it harkens back to the kind of thing that was done a lot in the Looney Tunes, the Tom and Jerry, Warner Brothers, Bugs Bunny era, when the animators were a lot less inhibited than we are now. And one problem that a lot of us have when we're working with either 3D rigs or Flash or Harmony rigs is that the rig takes over. So in this case, you break out of the rig if you have to work in a rig system, and you have to find a way to see if it's practical to do this. And it's only 3 drawings or three unique frames that you have to create. So if you can get away with doing it from time to time, it really adds a little bit of color to your scenes and your work. So keep it in mind. In the previous movies, I've been showing you frames or drawings that you feel rather than see. And the classic way of using this to save a lot of work is to transition between 2 different strong poses using a single frame or a couple of frames called a wipe or a blur. Let's have a look at this first in black and white. And from here, bang, he slams back into that. And in color, there again. So let's have a look in the black and white version. And there he goes. So this is a smear, and classically called a blur or a wipe, dry brush effect. There's various ways that animators would treat that, but it's a blur image or a multiple image. There's different phrases for it. Let's continue with the animation in color. Now we'll go through frame by frame. There's this little angry point. And there we go. Notice as well, this frame here softens into the final end pose. So you can have 2 or 3 or 4 frames easing into the second or final state. Now the beauty of this is if you have a strong pose and you want to quickly go into another strong pose, it can be a lot of work to gracefully or traditionally animate from pose A into pose B. So this is an extremely fast way to cheat your way from one into the other. So if you watch again the classic Looney Tunes cartoons, you'll see this happen a lot when they're going from different states, from very fast actions. The animators aren't troubling themselves a lot of the time, with anticipation, overshoot, settling. They're just slamming from pose to pose to pose using blurs and wipes. So if there's like a violent scene with Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny, would be a classic example. You'll see a lot of this kind of thing going on. So here's the timing of the series, and there you can see the frame where the smear happens. So again, if you're looking for a way, and especially if you're working in, again, one of the traditional drawing programs like Harmony or Flash, which is now called Animate, or any other traditionally drawn software or method, keep this in mind as a potential way. You wouldn't want to overuse it. It will get old very quick, but it's certainly a very useful trick to have when you want to very quickly move from one strong pose into another strong pose without having to animate a ton of keyframes. Another example of a fast animation that can kind of cover or cheat from one state into another state is a morph or a tween. And if you're looking at getting from one shape, say a sphere or a ball, into another shape, in this case a little strong man, you might wonder, how do we do that? How on earth do we transition from one extreme state into another? And the beauty, same general principle, is we just snap into it. So let's pause this at the ball. I'll just move back a bit. So we start with the sphere. It's very important to have an anticipation. If you're going to do a sudden snap or transition from one state to another state, and you want to cheat it, and in this case the cheat is actually snappier, it feels better to do it, then you want a good strong anticipation to tell the audience before you go somewhere that you're going to go there. So as we squish this thing down, the audience knows. They're not stupid. They know if that ball is squishing, something is going on. So when we snap into the humanoid form, it's like bang. When the magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat, the eye has been led to expect something to happen, and then you can transform instantly into this. At this point, normal animation rules take over, where we overshoot and settle. So the sin of changing from one object into the other object has been covered by the anticipation. And nothing wrong with that. No one's going to look at that and worry about the fact that, there really isn't an actual transition from ball to man. It's completely fooled the eye. Notice as well that when we go from one to the other, there isn't an enormous difference. I've pulled the man roughly as close as I could to the general area of the sphere. I didn't pop from this into something too wild. So especially the feet. I wanted the feet to be more or less occupying this area. We didn't want to have the feet, appear over here. That might be going a little too far with it. And so again, if you want to have an idea about the timing that I used, if you want to try to replicate this in your own medium, here is the series of anticipation images and then the actual transforms. Notice that there were only 3 keyframes for the figure. The first, number 8, where he snaps. The overshoot is on 11, and the settle, we slow in or ease in to the final frame 16. So not a lot of images required for a very cool and very convincing morph of a character. So this is a very simple head turn. We have the figures looking left, a little bit sad. Someone's behind a birthday cake. So he turns and hooray, it's my surprise birthday party. So this is the simplest possible way to do this. And let's take a look at the image frame by frame. So this is a typical way of doing it. There's a little downturn on the midpoint, on the break. It's really a breakdown. I've circled it like it's a keyframe, but it's really more of a breakdown. And it's a boring breakdown. It's, I didn't want to do anything too heroic or fancy with it. So what happens here is that the anticipation of the reaction happens at the fastest point in the turn. Now, the problem with doing that is a lot of the times you don't get to see the change in expression. You don't get to see that moment where he goes, aha. So let's see how we might achieve that. So one thing that you can do is to delay the change of expression. So what I've done here is very subtle. I've delayed it by 1 frame. So as he turns, the change of expression has been slowed down by 1 frame. So it's a very minor alteration, extremely subtle. Let's push this a little further. So here I've delayed it by 2 frames. Notice now at the far side of the turn, you're starting to see more of the alteration of the expression. So you're getting to see more of his mind working. And this is really crucial, where we're not just pushing graphical shapes around. He's meant to have an inner life. So let's see if we can push this even further. So now we're delayed by 3. And here you can see we're starting to really see the alteration happening in place. And now 1 more frame delay, and see how few frames are required to have the expression change really register. So we've overlapped the timing of the expression so that the drama, the reaction, the interior mind working has been locked in until he's more or less in place. Now, I've just delayed it by 4 frames. We could keep adding delays. We could have the same sad expression on the far side of the turn and then, bang, have the change happen. But I wanted to show just how subtle you can make this. And I'll show you all 4 together. So now for direct comparison, if you look across the screen from left to right, I let this loop a few times so you have the ability to just scroll back and forth. So the one on the far left, it's fairly mechanical. And if you go all the way to the right, you'll see the difference. And then we have the intermediates between them. So depending on how far you want to take this principle, you can see how the guy on the right looks much more naturalistic, much richer. That would be more typical of the kind of thing you'll see on feature animation. So Disney, Pixar, that kind of thing. The kind of animation you see on the far left, more like TV animation where you have fewer keyframes and you want to keep life simple. So if you're animating traditionally, it's a much more work to draw this on paper, the delay on the far side. If you're working in a rig system like Flash, it's surprisingly simple because you can delay the keyframe of the face. And I suspect similarly for CGI animators, it's probably much more easier to do these kind of overlaps. So remember to do this. And also one important thing, sometimes you have really ugly animations that you might want to hide. And if that's the case, then using the leftmost example, having the ugly transition happen on the midpoint is a good way to conceal things that you might not want the audience to see as well. So you can use these techniques both to highlight something that you want the audience to see or to hide something that you might not want the audience to see. So keep this trick in mind. It's a good one to have in the toolkit. Timing and spacing are 2 different things. So it's good to think of timing as the numbers that you assign to the keyframes, where the keyframes happen on the timeline. The spacing is the ease in and the ease outs to and from those keys. And here you can see 6 different examples of spacing differences. Now, of course, you can space the keys differently. So I could, for example, have spaced the ball at this side of the screen and moved it to this side of the screen. But in general, I think it's useful to think about the timing as the numbers that appear on the timeline and the spacing as the ease-ins, the ease-outs or not, and the different ways we can ease in and ease out from one key to the next key. So here's the same animations, and this time with the multiple images of the in-between so you can see the complete effect. So the timing is the same on all of these, the spacing is different, and you can see they feel quite different. So what if you want to change the timing itself? So here I've assigned different numbers to the keyframes. And in this example, I've taken the simple ease in, ease out animation. So the spacing is more or less the same, but I've changed the timing so that we have the top row is 9 frames, the middle row is 7, and the bottom row is 13. Now, of course, again, as I've already said, we can change the spacing by physically moving these balls to different positions, of course. But hopefully this has made clear the difference of timing and spacing. So know which is which and what you're referring to when you use the terms. Now, if you're wondering why this is so important, it's really going to come into play when you begin to animate different materials. And we'll look at that in the next movie. In the previous movie, we looked at timing and spacing and how we can change timing and spacing to create a very different impression of motion of the same object. We also use timing and spacing to influence the materials property of the object. So in this case, I'm treating the bouncing ball like it's a soccer ball. And it's really important to know what the different materials in your scene are supposed to be. So in this case, it's a fairly rigid sphere. It's still going to have a little bit of stretch to it and a fairly energetic bounce. So finally comes to rest. Let's have a look at the timing charts. So the timing chart that you see here is a traditional animation timing chart, and don't worry about it too much if you're working in CGI or some other software, but it's just a general nice way to see how I've spaced out the different in-between positions and whether they're easing in from a keyframe or easing out of it. So we have our frame 1 at the top, and I've written just for clarity, I've written the frame number as well inside the image of the ball, so you can have a better idea about what's happening and where. So on frame 14, we're falling and stretching and then impacting on 15. No chart on that one because it's just standalone by itself. The next key is 16, bouncing off the ground. And then we're slowing in, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 are one big slow in to 22. And that's the next up position. And then we slow out of 22 into the next fall, into 28. Little bit of stretch on this one, not as much as on number 14 because the amount of energy is beginning to dissipate. Impact again on 29, and the same basic process would just increase across the screen with less and less energy, so less squash and less stretch until we finally come to the last impact frame, and then it'll settle back into a sphere on 62. So this gives us a general idea about the timing and the spacing of a soccer ball. Now we can of course change the physical spacing of these balls, so I could move that ball further down or I can move that ball further up. But other than that, we're pretty much locked into something very similar to this. Now let's see how we would treat a different material. What if the ball isn't a soccer ball, and what if it's an inflatable beach ball? So here's my timing chart for a beach ball. And if I toggle back and forth from the soccer ball to the beach ball, there are physical differences. I've allowed the beach ball to float a little bit higher. It's lighter. So would it go higher than a soccer ball? I think it might. I wanted it to feel floatier, so I wanted to have more space for it to feel like it's just maybe being blown about by the wind a little bit. Also extended the timing, so 1:16:22 become 1:18:26. I could have extended it maybe further, but by and large, it's the same scene. We've just made some adjustments to the positions of the balls and to the timing. So here's the animation of the beach ball. And looking at it now, it could probably be slowed down a little more, but it certainly feels different to the soccer ball. Now let's have a look at a third kind of material. What if we have a material that's radically different from either of these? So it's a metal sphere. This is to show you that we don't have to do another bounce for a metal ball. We're perfectly within our rights to do something drastically different. Now, I still have a timing and spacing, of course, which is about the same as the soccer ball in this case, but there's no bounce. So it just slams into the ground and shatters it. So it's a complete change of the physical properties of the way the ball interacts with the environment. Let's go through this like frame by frame. And the other thing that I've done is I've removed most squash and stretch. So it remains pretty much a sphere all the way down. I've given a token stretch on the final sphere before impact, and that's just to accentuate the feeling. So it's one of these drawings that you feel it, you don't really see it. And then we have the impact. So let's have a look at these three side by side. And now you can really see the difference. And notice too that the beach ball feels quite different. It's certainly much softer, much different property from the soccer ball. And I think the metal ball falls, let's see if I go frame by frame. I've even cheated physics a little bit and have it fall much faster than the soccer ball. So a bit of cartoon physics going on, which never hurts. So the impact of the metal ball happens on frame 12, whereas the soccer ball has 2 or 3 more frames to go before it impacts the ground. And then 2 or 3 more before the beach ball hits the ground, so more wind resistance. So timing and spacing and how they're your absolutely essential tools if you want to convince the audience that they're looking at materials that are made of different things. In the previous movie, I showed you how to use timing and spacing to make a ball look like it was a soccer ball or a beach ball or a metal sphere. And of course, the same thing applies probably more typically to clothing and to more everyday objects that we encounter. So in this case, 3 different approaches to the same animation, but to create a feeling of a cape that could be made out of a very light, silky satin material on the left, something with a middle level of weight to it like cotton in the center, and then something really heavy like you think about King Arthur or some medieval warlord, and kind of think about somebody from Game of Thrones, one of those kind of very earthy and heavy cloak, and that'll be on the right side. So let's take a look at how we are creating these different feelings with timing and spacing. So on the top row, you'll see that we have the light material, and the middle row, the medium one, and the bottom row, the heavy material. And notice also, I deliberately kept the animation the same. I didn't change the animation on either of these. And that way you can do a direct comparison of the feeling of each simply by changing the timing and the spacing of the keyframes and the in-betweens. So this is something that you would be able to affect without altering the artwork itself. And if you really want to see the nuts and bolts, this is the complete sequence of in-between frames, or the timing charts to show the spacing, and where we have ease-ins, ease-outs, or none. Some of these are quite railroad tracks. You see from here to here, I wanted a very even spacing, something that wasn't going to be too dramatic, and that does occasionally slow in to a high point here. You can see on this one from 16 to 20, what's happening is we're going from 16 here to 20 there, and we're slowing into it, 17, 18, 19, slowing in to 20. Slowing out at 20 as gravity begins to take over, 21, 22, 23, 24. So that's how you read these charts. So let's take another look. So we've seen what we can achieve if we simply change timing and spacing of clothing. But what if you want to just take it a little bit further and obviously change maybe the animation itself? So a light material will be more prone to gust of wind. So it should be within rights with a given gust that moves it to here. A medium-sized wind would be able to pull it back fairly high. A heavier material really shouldn't move that high, so maybe it would move to about here, and the really heavy cloak would have a much harder time being lifted very high, so we could maybe drag it to there. So in this case, what I've done is I've very simply adjusted the high point of the cape flutter and just pulled it down on the middle figure and pull it even lower on the heavier one. So you get the idea. So you're not limited to simply nudging keyframes and timing and spacing. You can also layer changes to the position of the artwork as well. So your pose, your character can be altered. And before you animate a character in costume, it's a good idea to have a general idea. You don't necessarily have to know that, the weave of the fabric of what the character's wearing, but you should have an idea. This is silk-y, or this is like cotton, or this is like, really, really heavy, Game of Thrones, Ned Stark's, something like out of Lord of the Rings. A cloak like that, like Boromir's cloak, that's going to be much harder to move. So that's not going to be doing this unless he's standing in a hurricane. So again, it's just remember that you're trying to animate things that are physical, that have physical properties, and use your timing, your spacing to control that. So now we'll talk about texture. And texture is the principle of moving an object through the screen in a way that, has texture to it. It slows in, it slows out. It doesn't move all the time at the same speed. Different parts of the body will have different ease-ins and ease-outs. They all have their own properties. So in this case, I've made a very cute little robot, flies in, but there's no texture here. The entire thing, if you look at this in charts or in all the in-betweens, they're perfectly evenly spaced. So now in the bottom half of the screen, we have the same animation, but I've added some ease-ins and ease-outs. So you may or may not be able to notice it. This is one of the things that falls under the heading of subtle, but it is important. So we're zipping in very fast, slowing into the stand position, and then that little dip he does at the end right there also has a nice little slow in. So here he is side by side. So what I've done is I picked the antenna on the top of his head as a point to plot because it's really simple to follow. And if you look at the beginning where we zoom in, you can see on the top line we have the railroad track On the bottom line, we have a very, very dramatic slow in to that stop position. And then the second half of the scene is where he does his little circular motion. And look at the plot point of the arcs and timing and spacing on the top. And you can see again railroad tracks. They are evenly spaced. On the bottom, we have a much nicer spacing where we move fast and then slow in to this point up here where he holds just for a little bit, not by much, slows out, gets faster and faster, and then slows in again here. So we have a nice fast to slow, slow to fast, and then back eases into the end state. So the figure on the bottom is much nicer, but again, subtle. So again, just to focus on it, and here I've zoomed in really, really tightly on the arc plot of the antenna so you can really see what's going on. So always be on the lookout for places where you can apply that texture to a character. And notice as well that I've clustered it where it should cluster. If we move to a point here at the end of a motion, it's more likely that you will see a slight slow in at the top and a slow out coming out of it. And of course, if he's going to stop in a pose, we're going to slow in to that stop pose. So this is a very simple introduction to the concept of texture in a character animation. In the previous movie, we saw how to add texture to a scene. So let's see how we can apply the same principle to a more naturalistic or a more humanoid figure. And also how we can apply different textures to different parts of the body. So in this case, we have a very smoothly animated scene. I don't think there's very much texture here. I think he's on railroad tracks. There are about 4 or 5 keyframes moving him through this little circular head action. He has his little punch in the air, attaboy gesture. So let's see how we can improve this. So the first thing to do is to add just a basic ease in and ease out. So he, eases out of that first action and eases into the top. So it's feeling a little less mechanical already, but we can again take it much further than this. So on the third pass, what I've really done is I've pushed the timing so that we ease in much sharper to the anticipation and we slam out of it much harder. So there are more frames clustered around the anticipation and more in-betweens. So we have a much snappier punching of the air. So this was done without changing the animation. This was all done by altering the timing to increase the texture. So before I show you how this was done, just a reminder that this was the series of arcs that I used to construct the animation. So very nice, especially on the attaboy. I really wanted something that was going to dip down and give us like a nice up punch as a good accent at the end of the scene. And the head's just doing a very basic little loop-the-loop, like a little figure 8 kind of spiral thing. So this is the arc plot of the fist. So you can see how the first pass, there was no ease in or ease out. It's just railroad tracks all over the place. On the second pass, I applied some basic ease ins and ease outs. And then on the final pass, the one that really pushes it, you can see how I've completely modified without changing the overall arc path or the start point or the stop point or even the down point. You can see how the timing has been changed. So let me shuttle between the third version, which has some texture on it, and the fourth. Now, if we look at the, let's go back and forth. So the final one, and see how this point here, number 5, and then the previous version. So this is the middle strength version. So on this one, I've kept the beginning the same. These first 5 frames I didn't alter. I could have slammed them and eased them into here. But what happened is on the final version, I've pushed all of the in-betweens much higher. So the ease in is really clustered around the top. So let's follow frame 10, for example. And if I go back to the earlier version, see how further down it happens. On the stronger version, it's really held back. So we have a much wider spacing and much more kinetic strength or energy between 13, 14, 15, bang into 16. Whereas the mid-strength version, they're evenly spaced. They're still eased. It's still slowing in and slowing out, but it's much softer. I mean, look at that. You've got 13, 14, 15. Oh, that's a nice little tap. Whereas the strong version, 13, 14, 15, bang, that's a real punch. And we have a, 17, 18, 19, so we can still see it reads. And then we have the same principle applying at this side as well. So, but this is the one, that's where the accent is. That's where the fist goes and slams into the air and then comes back in. So let's take a look at the scene side by side. So on the top, you can see the complete railroad track version, and all that's doing is totally smooth motion. And it looks nice. I mean, it's not horrible or anything. But on the bottom version, we have texture. So if you can hold up a sheet of paper or your hand and just look at the top version, let it cycle maybe 3 or 4 times, then do the opposite and hide the top version and go back and forth. And that's what I'm doing right now. I'm holding my hand over one and then looking at the other, and you can really see. So this is the vitality of a scene can be amplified enormously by applying textured timing and also applying different timing patterns, different textures to different parts of the body. And that's where the difficulty comes in and the craft comes in, and you're just going to have to practice because it's not easy, but in the end, it's really worth it. I'd like you to know a little bit about some of the traditional terminology that's used in the industry. Some of it is an anachronism from a time when footage was footage, when it was physically measured. So some of the terms are still used, but you might not be sure exactly what that is. So in the early period of film, when film was shot on film, there were 24 frames in a second, and 16 frames of 35mm film was about 1 foot, hence the term footage, which we still use. So we have traditionally trained animators like myself who have transitioned into working on computers, and we're comfortable, working with different frame rates, 24 frames or 30 frames a second are two of the most common. We have then the principle of animating on 1s, 2s, and 3s. And it was discovered fairly early on, and I think it was on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the Disney original, where it was realized that you could, instead of having to animate 24 drawings for every second and having a nervous breakdown, you could shoot 12, and then you could shoot 1 frame and hold it for 2. So you would draw 12 frames, and then you would put your first drawing, or 12 drawings, you would put your first drawing on the camera stand and go click, click. Put your second, click, click, your third, click, click. Hence, this was on 2s. So you would still have to animate on 1s for very fast actions and for pans and camera moves, but most of the film could be done on 2s. And it never really caught on in the earlier period in the West, but in the Japanese animation, it's common to see animation on 3s. And that will give you 24 frames a second, a virtual speed of 8 frames a second, on 2s, 12 frames a second, and on 1s, 24 frames a second. So that's when you hear an animator talking about it's animating on 1s, or it's on 2s, or it's on 3s. That's what they're referring to. So if you're wondering what that looks like, here's what it looks like. So the ball on the top is on 1s, in the middle on 2s, bottom is on 3s. So you're getting that kind of anime effect on the bottom row. And it's something that your eye just gets used to. I mean, if you start watching a movie on 3s, you'll get used to it after a while, and it looks fine. But plenty of people are very happy to watch lots of cartoons on that. And some of the TV shows that were done in the 80s really began to go even further than that, and even too far. Any further than any frame rate lower than 8 frames a second, you're in dangerous territory. Now, you might have heard the expression a dope sheet, also called an exposure sheet or an X sheet. And these were sheets of paper that the animator in the traditional period had to explain his scene on, so that when the scene went to the next person in the production pipeline, they wouldn't just have a stack of 400 sheets of paper. They would actually know where they went. So if you look at this is a typical X sheet. The production's called John and Jane. This is sequence 3, scene 20. Sheet 1 of 2, so there's 2 of these sheets. The scene starts here. Sometimes people will write notes and other commentary in here where needed. The action, Joe says, "Why did you let the dog out?" The dialogue is broken down on the track read here by phonemes. Why do you let the, etc. We have our frame numbers, so the camera person and people in the technical departments can be completely sure what frame they're on. The scenes go from the back, from bottom to top, from right to left. So the background level will be held here. And then A01 is the Joe level. And then you can see his the right frame number. He's on 2s, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, and so on. Jane is held for that many frames. Then maybe she has an eye blink or something, and then she's held again and starts moving. And the dog has a tail wagging cycle. So he's cycling 1 through 11, 1 through 11, and so on. And this is an overlay. That's the table. So there's a pan, and that can be started here. And it's just lightly sketched in here, but technical departments might come along and start putting in pan numbers and all kinds of scary technical stuff. So what happened to these? And I'll explain what happened to these. Programmers happened to these, and they came along with their software, and they said, this is no good. Let's turn it 90 degrees to the left, and then we'll get rid of all the space there. And then we'll also notice that they got rid of the phonemes. There's no place for that. So that gets replaced by the waveform. And then they went one further and turned all of the frame numbers into dots, so you can't tell what everything is. And then they squashed them down to fill more, which is good. So you can at least have more layers. And then the names get moved to here. And you have your frame numbers, which oftentimes you can't fit in because, the fonts are too small. And so that is what happened to the X sheet. So many of us had a very hard time when this happened, but we've kind of gotten used to it now. I do miss the fact that it was easier to see exactly what these were, but you kind of find little tricks to memorize what keyframes were where. So anyway, that is the evolution or devolution of the X sheet into your timeline. So you might have seen these floating around. It's a field guide, and we used to animate on 12 field and 16 field, meaning 12 inches or 16 inches, and extremely technical and not a lot of fun to work with, but you would have different cutoffs for, different formats. Some animators would work on 9 fields, and I won't bore you anymore with that. Suffice to say, we don't really have to worry about this anymore because it's all done ad hoc, more or less, in various computer programs. But we do have the holdover of watching out for safe areas, which is what, many of these field guides would help you find, the point where you were, you have to draw at least to here or, to the 10 field line or the 11 or the 12. So we still have to worry about things like safe area and your aspect ratio. But in terms of plotting, like detailed technical moves, no, those days are, at least for most of us, I think, in the rear view mirror. So the real trouble scenes we used to have to deal with were pan scenes. And here you see a cartoon of myself at an animation desk, and you have the circular board with the circular peg holes, and pan scenes will be usually have different peg holes. The round holes will be A, B, C, D, E, and F. And you'd see some poor unlucky devil with a pan scene that went to J or K once, and they weren't happy about it. The very first scene I was given to work on was a horrible pan scene on top pegs. So the paper was mounted on the top pegs, and it was a cruel thing to inflict on a newbie. So be thankful if you don't work on paper anymore that you don't have to deal with this. And there's a picture of me in 1991 or 92 on one of the Don Bluth movies. I think it was Pebble and the Penguin. And you can see the 16 field animation disc. So again, a very expensive piece of equipment that we don't have to, most of us don't have to deal with. And there you can see hanging behind me a very crude cardboard field guide with the cutoff, so I could see very quickly if I was, animating within the right field. So we would draw on paper, and the paper would be punched. So you'd have the round peg hole and the rectangular peg holes. And you still see artifacts of some of this occasionally used in Harmony, the 2D animation program. They still occasionally use motifs like the peg holes. So, which is why I want to explain some of this material to you, because sometimes these anachronisms do come back. And the peg holes would, if you were moving the paper on and off the pegs, the holes would stretch. So you would put little stickers, reinforcements on them. And then you'd do your drawing. So you do a drawing number 1, your first bouncing ball drawing, with the timing chart on the top right of the drawing. And as you can see here, we're slowing out of the number 1 into frame 11. That's our second drawing now, and that's 11 with the next timing chart to the next or third keyframe. And on the bottom, you would draw the sequence, scene number, and again, the frame number here. So you would have your frame number here and here. So you'd have different drawings. You'd have stacks of these, and long scenes would be pretty heavy. You could have very long scenes were quite the thing, real bookends. So that was the general process of laying out hand-drawn animation on paper and the process of sticking it on drawing boards. So in the next movie, we'll go into a little more detail on this. So traditional animation involves drawing a series of keyframes on paper, and then you stack the paper pages on a pegboard and you begin rolling them. So the process looks something like that. And the flipping, if you do it fast enough, you can more or less get the impression of physical motion. So each keyframe drawing is circled, and they often contain a timing chart, and the timing chart instructs the assistant and the in-betweener about the spacing of the breakdown drawings and the in-between drawings. And these timing charts, they're usually drawn on the upper right side of the page. So here are some examples. I've shown you these in the previous movie of timing charts with corresponding animations to show the effect. And I've rotated these charts to the horizontals, for clarity. It's easier to read. Here are more examples, and in this case, the timing of the keys has been changed as well as the spacing of the in-betweens. So these charts are essential in traditional animation because they give the animator complete control over the timing and the spacing of the scene. Probably one of the most important factors, maybe the most important factor in animation. So here's an example of a quick thumbnail sketch with the timing and the spacing lightly suggested on the top. And here's the final scene, pretty much as it was laid out in the thumbnail, just polished. And if you look at the top right, you can see the numbers shuttling away, and that's the kind of thing that we would have seen in the traditional animation era a lot. So let's break down the rough approach of how traditional animator would approach a scene. So the first thing that you would do would be a rough pencil test. And in this case, the scene is shot as a line drawing. Sometimes in blue drawing, we had these horrible blue Chromacolor pencils that I still hate to this day, and drawn in blue because they wouldn't be picked up by the Xerox machines when we were scanning them. So they're really horrible. So the only thing that we draw in this part are mostly the keyframes. So the animator then has to shoot the scene with these frames held according to their frame number. So for example, frame 1 will be held until frame 15, which is held until frame 22, and so on. And so you get this like staggered kind of feeling. So this is called a pose test. And the pose test can be very rough, or in this case, a little tidier than most maybe. So once the animator and the director are happy with the scene just by looking at it in this form, they can then pass it on to the assistant or the in-betweener for all the additional frames to be added. So to create the in-between frames, it's necessary to flip the paper instead of rolling it. Now this involved putting two keys on the lower level, the beginning key and the end key, and then putting the breakdown or the in-between on the top layer and then flipping between them. So you're doing this like back forth action. And it is a tricky move when you begin, but most people will get the hang of it after a few days of this flipping process. And at that point, it becomes an automatic thing that you don't even have to think about. So when the assistant has completed the breakdowns, the largest and the most important gaps between the keys, then they'll often reshoot the animation because you really want to be absolutely certain this scene is going to work. And the more in-between frames you get, the closer you get to the final thing. So if there's a mistake in the keyframes or the breakdown frames and the poor in-betweener comes along and in-betweens 40 or 50 drawings, they're all going to be wrong. So the animator, the assistant, the director have to look at this pose test with the breakdowns added and go, yeah, this is it. This is going to look good. And so the last step in the rough animation process was the creation of the rough in-betweens. And they finally smooth out the action. Now this is the point when we can all look at it and go, yeah, that looks nice. And as you can see, judging the look of the final animation from the previous test, the pose test alone, is very difficult. And a lot of animators just weren't really comfortable doing it. And it's just one of those things you have to develop a feeling for. Others can do it really easily, and they can look at a pose test and go, perfect. So you may fall somewhere between that spectrum. I'm kind of so-so about it. I can look at a pose test and go, 80%, maybe 75% sure that scene's going to work, but I'm never totally sure until the in-betweens are done. So that's the completion at this point of the rough in-between process. So the next step, believe it or not, there's another step, is to take that rough scene into the cleanup department. Now, the key cleanup artist just works with the animator's keys, the key drawings, and they tie them down into a much cleaner, tighter black line. And the really sad part about this is that the process usually sucks a lot of the vitality out of the rough drawings. Rough drawings are much more enjoyable to look at than cleanup drawings, but we had to clean them up to be able to paint them on originally transparent cells and later inside a computer. So my personal preference is what to do about this problem. You feel the need to clean things up, but you like a bit of roughness to it to have the life in it. So I think the best animation has a kind of a hybrid halfway style between rough and clean. And if you look at the Disney movie Jungle Book, you'll see that. And 101 Dalmatians, there was like a really lovely period there where, and on The Rescuers as well, I think it was the last of the great movies of that style, where you could sense like a lot of the roughness coming through, and they hadn't developed that really sterile cleanup look that I think took over after that. So if you do decide to work in any kind of a traditional medium, trying to get some kind of edginess or roughness or looseness to your drawings is essential, I think, if you can do it. So after the cleanup artist has finished cleaning up the keys and draining all the life out of the scene, the scene goes to the cleanup in-betweeners and breakdown artists, and then they have to do the real tedious work of cleaning up. You would not believe how many drawings, and over and over and over again. So that is the traditional era, and of course the last step will be to paint it or to take it into a digital ink and paint program. So let's take a look at the final scene. So this is the final scene in color. The timing charts haven't been removed, so somebody should be fired about that. And up until the early to mid 90s, a lot of this was still painted physically onto sheets of transparent cell. And as the 90s ground on, it was all done on computers. The cleanup drawings were scanned into a computer, which made life much easier and took a lot of jobs away too. So the final scenes, though, would be then painted on the computer. And as a result, you have a much easier life, because as you can imagine, taking a brush to a piece of cell or clicking a button on a computer screen are two very different things. So that completes our kind of very quick overview of the traditional animation series and some of the terminology used, as well as some of the general work processes used, and especially important to make note of the timing charts, because I still use these. I think they're a great way to explain to people where the key actions are, where the breakdowns are. And I think without the timing charts, I think you're doing yourself a big disservice. So even if this isn't directly applicable to you, it's still good to keep this thing in mind, because it was good enough for the golden age. So it's still good enough for us. One of the problems you'll see with a lot of drawings and even scenes now on shows is what I call zero pose disease. And that's when somebody takes a rig from a library, either CGI or Flash or Harmony, and they pull it onto the stage. And so you have everybody pose like this. And it's really, really boring and kind of lazy, because no scene should start like that, or really even have poker-like scenes like this, very often. So one of the tricks that we use to prevent that from happening is the very old technique used in classical art called counterpose or torque. And that's simple to twist the weight of the character. So we move the hips to one side and the shoulders to the other. And it doesn't have to be a lot. So these are drawings that I created for a previous course on how to draw cartoon characters. So if you want to find out how to draw some of the fine points of this, that course is an excellent one. But the amount of counterpose can increase as much as you think the design will take. So, you can have these very energetic walking poses. The only thing you got to watch out for, of course, is how this is going to, deform your character design. So if you're working with a flash rig, it might be harder to do this, or a Harmony rig, or a CGI rig, but you really should try to see if it's possible to do as much as you can with these various puppet tools and other techniques as possible. And if you're drawing, of course, then the only limit is your own drawing ability. So as you can see at the bottom row, we have the left side in red, the right in blue. And on this side, you see that on the throw, both are facing the same direction, but on the overshoot, we counterpose. It's really nice. So you get these really strong, very natural looking poses. And on this side, we have a walking pose. And in the walking pose, the counter pose is in constant opposition. So if one hip is facing towards you, the opposite shoulder is facing the other direction, as you can see in the two contact positions here. And so there's a close-up of the top row. And you can see the nice contrast between, or the alternation between, these two strong key drawings. So here's a nice little animation showing the kind of charm that you can get from simple application of counterpose or torque. So from a previous course that I've done about walking and walk cycles, here you can see the hips and the shoulders and how they're in constant opposition to one another. So the walk cycle is almost entirely in some form or other of counterpose. So remember this cool little technique, because I think it'll be very useful in helping you to break out of static poses. This movie will cover some basic principles of construction and proportion. And once again, these are some images that I've created for a previous course on how to draw cartoon characters for animation. But they're very useful as slides, so I'm going to include them here. And as you can see, this is a naturalistic skeleton, and in 4 different positions. So you can see that we tend to measure the body in head heights. So we take and it's not like written in stone, it's a general rule of thumb that's fairly useful. So the body is usually about 8 heads tall. The midpoint, being the lower part of the groin, is around at the halfway point of 1, 2, 3, 4 heads. 1, 2, 3, 4 heads here. The knees roughly at the 2 head mark, and so forth. So you can see the elbows are at the 3 head mark. Do not go getting out a ruler. This is the kind of thing that you really need to eyeball when you're drawing, because you can be rotating the body into different angles and whatnot. So the body can be foreshortened. So this is not the kind of thing that is going to allow you like a magic bullet in order to get the perfect figure. There's no such technique, but it's like I said, good solid rule of thumb. Get you into the approximate area that you want to be, so that you don't end up with bizarrely proportioned figures. And as you can see on the right side, here's our clothed man, or our skinned man, and the baby to the right shows you the proportion of the head to the body of a baby is much smaller. So whereas a mature human is about 8 heads tall, baby is about 2 or 3. At least the cartoonier forms of the baby, the head is bigger proportionally to the body. So again, these are the different angles of the skeleton. So we can just rotate them in place and you get a very nice sense of the dimension of it. And now let's take a closer look at the head. And the same basic principle applies. This is like an idealized placement of eyes relative to the top of the head. So about halfway down, the eye line will be somewhere around there. At another halfway point, or the quarter mark, the tip of the nose. And the lower lip is sometimes measured at another halfway point. So when you're designing characters, you're going to be looking for some kind of pattern like this. And you can invent your own if you're making a cartoony character. But some way of locking or making consistent, reasonably consistent, big features like eye lines, nose positions is very important. And again, a close-up of skull with the head overlaid. Very important to remember that the jaw, and you can test this yourself right now by moving your jaw around a little bit, it can open very wide. So even if you're working with a naturalistic design, people tend to be very stiff and inhibited about their drawings and their designs. So don't forget that the jaw can scream pretty loud, and the lower jaw can then rotate and pivot. It's not just a levered up and down. It also has access to a side-to-side movement. I'm even doing it as I speak, so just to prove it to myself. And if you look at the side view, the jaw can also move back and forward. So When people talk about a character being on model, it doesn't preclude you from taking great liberties with that design as you need it. The worst thing you can have is a client who is very literalistic and who says, that's the model, and will describe this and this as off model, even if there's a very good reason for your character to do these kind of shapes. So we have our basic position, and then we have this range of motion as well. And the other thing to remember is when you're doing dialogue, is that most of the speaking is done not by the jaw action, but by the tongue. So what this means is that a great deal of the dialogue is created in a way that's invisible to the eye. So yes, the lips move, and yes, the jaws move, but you do not have to articulate every single phoneme and audio shape, because the heavy lifting is very often invisible to the eye. So with that done, in the next movie, I will show you more applications of construction techniques. In the previous movie, we saw how you can use a basic rule of thumb to create good proportions for a realistic character. Now let's look at some cartoony characters and how the basic principles apply here. And we have our archetypal characters. On the left, the doughboy, then the baby type, then the heavy character, then the lanky guy, muscles, the hero and the heroine, so on. So let's take a look at the lanky character. Now this format can be transposed, and he has long, thin body, not a very long, thin body. The body is about a kidney bean shape, and there are variations on this. It doesn't have to be exactly this dimension, but he will be characterized a bit like Goofy in the Disney pantheon, with long, gangly legs, long limbs, kind of awkward. So let's see how we can transpose that formula onto completely different species and types of characters. So we have, Goofy bird, we have the funky dog, we have the wacky alien. We can even apply it to robots. So it's not as though we're limited to one form. So the important thing when using these techniques is to build them out of a series of primitives, whether you model them in 3D or you're doing them in a flat medium like traditional drawing or Harmony or Flash. You should try to think about things as built around boxes, cylinders, spheres, kidney beans, some basic simple geometry that you can then control. So you're not just willy-nilly using extremely complex forms. You have to simplify and you have to reduce to something that you can then manipulate much more easily. So some basic library of forms like this. And as you can see, in this case, we've built a strongman and the muscular type, narrow hips, broad shoulders, kind of thin waist. And because he's built around these simple forms, it's fairly easy once you get the knack to, I shouldn't say it's fairly easy, but it's easier than it could be to control these kind of figures. So let's take a look at the typical gangly character. And once again, we're constructing these figures out of formulas. So we need to be fairly consistent, not again measuring in rulers, but we need to be reasonably consistent about the proportions of the body to the head. So these are two variations of a character in the, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Daffy Duck, Bugs Bunny, that kind of general type. And you will see variations even within that, but something like 4 heads tall or 4.5 heads tall would be fairly typical. So that way the animators know, okay, once I draw the circle for the head, 3 more of them and I have the foot placement. So it gets you fairly close. And then another, head and a half, the waist or whatever. So that gets the animators at least a fighting chance of not being totally off model. So here what I've done is animated through one growth cycle of one of these characters. So I've taken the baby and I'll show you how he grows through being the zany kind of character to the lanky kind of character. So let's start the scene. And he grows up smooth and then down again. So by varying these proportions, you can see, and here I'm stopping at each half head and head height so you can see more clearly how we can vary this. So you have options of going smoothly at any point between these heads. But of course, I strongly recommend that you would actually select, like somewhere from one of the head heights, because it's just easier to control your proportions. So in this case, we have a 3 head tall character, kind of young. And as we grow up a little bit, and they grow up so quick, he's now 3.5 heads tall. And there we have between the 3 to 4 head height, we have our very familiar kind of range of many, many cartoon characters that are within that spectrum. And then, of course, as we grow taller, he's looking more like a normal adult. And if we go further and further, he starts turning into something that's a little more cartoony and extreme. So you can apply this principle to any of these characters. But again, the takeaway from this is try to have some consistent formula so that you have a character measured in head heights or some other metric or pattern that you can follow. So for example, Muscles here, he's like one head here. So 2, 3, 4, he's maybe 5 heads tall. The waist section, maybe his belly button is at 2 heads high. So this way you can control the proportion of the character. Secondly, make sure that the characters are built or designed around fundamentally simple forms, kidney beans, circles, boxes, that kind of thing. Now we're going to take a close-up look at the eyes, specific parts of the body, the figure. And the eyes are the most important part of the entire character. And they're also, as it turns out, I think the most difficult. And it's the problem where a lot of CGI stumbles on. You'll see these amazing renders, except for the eyes, and they look like little dead marbles. So the strange thing is, if you're a traditional animator, it's much easier because you don't have to worry about these hyper-realistic eyeballs. The human brain will accept this style of eye as real much more easily than it will like an amazingly rendered CGI computer animated project, because it's too close to reality almost. So at least we have that advantage going for us. So remember that the eye is a ball, it's a sphere, and you're not drawing. It's easy to look at it and fall into the trap of thinking that it's just a round curve and a circular ellipse in the face. What you're seeing is an opening of a part of the eyeball which is much larger. Follow the red. So be conscious of that when you're drawing the eye. From some angles, you're not going to be drawing the perimeter of the eye. When you're looking front on, for example, then yes, you're just drawing a little opening or a window. But when you're in a 3/4 or a profile, yes, that curve then is representing a perimeter, that silhouette or that edge of the physical eye. So you can see it here very slightly in the 3/4 view. Not every 3/4 view, but certainly in this style, and the style that I've chosen here. I'm thinking of this as the edge of the eyeball. And again, from the profile view with a realistic eye, and that's going to apply to a cartoonier 1940s style and even to a graphic modern style. And in this row, you can see the same principle applying. So in different styles, we have, of course, our classic button eye, which is very easy to draw, very appealing. We can make it a little more realistic if you're going for this kind of style, but it's still a button eye. But the second you go to showing whites of the eye, and then you have to deal with or contend with the issue of making it look real or appealing. So certain tricks that I use is breaks on the lower eyelid. So at this point here, through here, that's the lower eye. Even though it's one continuous line, you can really spot it now when you see these little red ticks. Those are the breaks, very subtle. And we have other breaks up here, right there, and that differentiates the edge of the eye. And then the rest of this line is the upper eyelid. Slight break there just for graphical reasons, very subtle. The same principle applies on this eye, corner of the eye, edge of the lower eyelid, and then the upper eyelid is ending right here. And then you can see it if you follow there. So as you can see, these are not simply 2 elliptical shapes that I just dropped onto the page. They're well thought out. And then if you look at the overlay then of the eye, you can see the same principle applying here and in this squash. So you can see how I've squashed the eyeball even inside the skull. This is a cartoon, so we can do it. But it's nice to think about what that's going to do to the entire form of the eye here and here. And then if we cycle through just the frames in place, you can get the idea. So again, here you can see the general principle. I've animated a scene of the head spinning around to different directions with the eyes kind of hideously revealed in red x-rays. So they're not like 100% nailed down. I'd like to go over these and tighten this a little bit, but you get the idea. They're fairly close. So you can see where we're dealing with the edge of the actual sphere, and you can see where we're not. And if we move on, you can see we're just about looking at the edge of the eyeball mass there. So when you're constructing the head, there are various ways of placing the eye line. Very common to place the eye line at the halfway point. You can place it 1/3 down or even 1/3 up. So in this example, I've gone from a series where I've got the eye line at the halfway point of the globe or of the skull, and it goes as far down as the third. I actually worked on one project where they put it 1/6 because they wanted to have like a very peanut-shaped head, and that was kind of interesting. And the other thing to bear in mind too, you can design the eye so that the lower eyelid sits on that line, or you can, I think it's more sensible to actually place the midpoint of the eye there instead and build it around that. So I think it just gives you more control when you're squashing the eye or you're stretching the eye to do it around a point rather than to have it sit on this. But you may find projects that need it to sit on a line or not. So I've shown different options here. So here's an animation showing the different positions in that graphical example. And as you can see, I've actually animated between them. So just again to make you realize you have options between these. You have the ability to, pick different combinations, mix and match. So another couple of notes is that the corner of the eye can be built around the equator. So you can have the corner on one side here and the other corner there. Or, as often happens, you can tilt the corner up so that you get a more elfin or almond-shaped eye. And that's very common. It makes the character look a little more interesting. So also more feminine if you want that. It doesn't have to be feminine either. You can actually make very angular male faces by doing this. A lot of the classic Disney Don Bluth styles from the 70s and 60s I think are more prone to this kind of look. So here you can see where I've pushed the corner of the eye up based around that. It does mean it's kind of harder to pinpoint. The construction means you got to eyeball, pardon the pun, the corner of the eye to get it right. So it's something that you get used to. And then we can tilt and rotate the head around once we have our construction down. In this case, I've gone with the corner of the eye more or less along the equator. So as we rotate the head, you can see the thing to watch out for is to maintain distance between the eyes so it's fairly consistent, and to watch the volume so that the eye, even though the volume of course will change, you still want it to be changing logically. So as the eye moves around the head, you see it begins to curve. And actually in this case here, there's skin there, which probably would be better if we didn't. You have the option, depending on your preference, of just getting rid of that little white space between the corner of the eye and the perimeter of the head. So let me show you what this looks like when we animate it. So once we add all the in-betweens, you can see that it creates a very nice, very controlled series of actions. So I'm not losing the sense of dimension. There's a couple of spots, I'll flag them for you now, that I would like to go in and tighten up. If we go from here, the start position, notice the gap between the two eyeballs and make a mental note of that gap. Look at the dotted line, look at the white space between here and here. It seems to have become a little inconsistent. It's grown a little too much on this side and, maybe lost a little too much there. We're not talking about a great deal that's throwing it. It's maybe on the order of 2 or 3 pixels. Then we go to here, that looks okay. That looks fine. And that looks okay. There's a little gain of volume at the end. Let me show you here. From here to there, the eyes seem to gain a little too much volume. So that's another spot here. These eyes should be made a little bit smaller. But that's small things where this scene is pretty close. It's got some very nice dimensional eyes. Another aspect of good eye design is that they shouldn't be the same size. A little bit of variation from one to the other, unless you're looking straight on. As the head turns left or right, one eye will, of course, seem to be a little bigger than the other. So that's why I do that throughout here. We have the larger eye near, smaller further away. Same here. This one's maybe a little too big, so I would pull that one in just a little bit. It's for a stronger comparison. So that is a run through of a nice scene, but one that maybe needs about 3 to 4% more work on it just to tie it down. But watch out for those kind of things when you start building either drawings or rigs, especially if you're working in a drawing program like Flash Animate or Harmony, because that's the kind of thing that will trip you up most often. And one last little thing to remember too is if you look at again, this is like something that could have waddled out of the 1940s. So you have eyes that can be designed along a pure vertical axis. You can also tilt them, left and right. So we have, straight up, or we can do that, which has a little more personality and also a slightly more interesting negative shape between the eyes. So that's as much as I can extract from my memory banks of eyes and how to construct them and how to animate them. Now let's take a look at the eyebrows, because the eyebrows interact with the eyes. They can really, they frame the eye. So it's one thing to have control over the mask of the eyeball itself, but it's also important to have a good feeling for eyebrows and how they affect them. Best animator I ever worked with was a master of controlling eyebrows, and he really did some wonderful stuff with them, put enormous vitality into his acting. So here we have 4 good examples of pushing the eyebrows from their neutral position into, both a down and more of a, neutral on this side, but like a skeptical kind of frown on this side, glowering here, pushing the entire muscle mass of the center of the head, clustering wrinkles down here. And then the opposite. This eye form will work for worried, concerned, sad, all kinds of emotional states. So if you can certainly master this kind of shape and this kind of shape, you'll be doing very well. And then this, of course, being a kind of a combination of a bit of the both. So here's what the previous 4 positions look like when they're finally animated. And it's a very simple animation between each one. I haven't done anything fancy. This is just setting up those 4 shapes and in-betweening straight between them, easing in and easing out. So, and as you can see, there's a good sense of solidity. If you look at the way the creases are moving into one another, I'm not seeing anything jumping out at me as like catching my eye as horrendously unnatural. You have to watch very carefully when you're making these little creases at the corner to make sure that they're not doing anything too supernatural. The creases around the eye should move into one another logically. So, for example, no crease here because he's wide open, but then as he begins to stretch and stress his facial muscles, then we begin to see creases. And we could even add more. So, for example, on this frown here, we could add 2 or 3 more. They could pop in, ease in and ease out. So, they can be only visible for the scrunch face. We could put more creases on the upper head when the eyes are wide open. So, but for the most part, this is looking pretty solid. So these are my original drawings that I used as reference for that animation. So we can lock them down in place and zoom in a little bit tighter. So there's some things that I would definitely change. So for example, from here to here, again, look at the corner of that eye. I would like to just push that out maybe to there, add a bit more volume to that eye. These are the kind of things that are fine-tuning, and you can spot them if you toggle between 2 of your keys, or if you're using blend shapes or different symbol setups in a puppet rig system. It's good to be able to toggle between each of your big states like this and then compare them directly to see are the masses behaving correctly, or is there something there that I can tweak and fix before we begin animating 500 scenes of this character. So in this example, I've added kind of Groucho Marx eyebrows. For those too young to remember, he was a famous comedian from the 1930s and so forth. And if you haven't seen Marx Brothers movies, you should. So this is a good example, but it's built on the same eyebrow armature. I've simply built out big bushy eyebrows on top of it. Other than that, it's the same thing. So you can see here how we can take a simple form and expand upon it. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Same thing if you want to do the big classic Disney Don Bluth type eyebrows. You can build them around the same armature. Trickier with this one because of the, all the tufts and everything. And these are taken from my How to Draw Cartoon Characters for Animation course. So if you do want to drill into that, you're welcome to do so. But again, we have some nice transitions, and if I can toggle between each one, I can see if I'm gaining or losing volume. We're losing a little volume here If we go from there to there, you see that trouble spot. So I would ideally like to fatten out like one of these little tufts. That seems nice enough. Maybe gaining a little volume on the eyebrows though, so maybe shave them a little bit. Easy enough as well, just pull that line up to there would do it. So again, I'm flagging these minor volume errors just to show you exactly the kind of things you should be looking out for. And here we have eyebrows of a kind of a gargoyle or a troll or could be a gorilla, a monkey of some kind. And these are pretty nice. I'm just looking for possible design errors or bad blends. And I think from here to here that maybe we're gaining a little too much volume on that spot. So I'd like to shave that in a bit, maybe bring that point in a little bit, maybe to there. Not too much. But that line in a final animated version, I would probably follow that path. So again, that's the procedure that I use when I'm toggling between keyframes to check for consistency, for model, for good design. So, and again, I hope me pointing out some of these small volume errors, and they're fairly subtle, will give you a feeling for the kind of precision that you should be looking for in your own work.